Hello.
Hi everybody.
I'm Jenny, I'm one of the co-founders of My First 5 Years.
And I'm Alistair, and I'm one of the other co-founders of My First 5 Years. I say the other, there's only the two of us. I am the other co-founder of My First 5 Years.
So hope you're all having a good morning, or it's just the afternoon now, so happy noon.
We're doing really well. So.
Right, so we're here today to talk about building babies' brains. So I just find this a fascinating subject, and I remember when I used to run a children's day nursery, and I always thought babies would be the really boring age group to work with, and boy was I wrong, because actually when you know what's going on and what you're looking out for, and you start to understand the little things that babies do, they're such an exciting age. So we're really looking forward to exploring how babies' brains work. And I guess my first question would be whether you can really build a baby's brain.
Well, you can indeed. And when we think about building, there's obviously the idea of as in constructing and putting the brain together, but there's the idea that you can build what goes on inside a baby's brain. Now, babies' brains when they're born are about a quarter of the size that they will be when they become an adult, so they do actually physically grow as the baby grows, but they're born with most of the neurons that they will ever have in your brain. In fact, you lose them as you get older. That's probably where we are now. That's why we're so rubbish at the beginning, because we're losing our neurons. But the fact that they are born with the brain's not the size that it's going to be when they're an adult, but everything they need is in it. So when we talk about building a baby's brain in the context of how we're going to do that today in the live, it's about the fact that the brain is basically got the potential to be, and it's through experience and interaction that you can actually make the brain into something. So when we talk about building, it's the fact that can we give children experiences that really help to make their brain the best that it can be.
We talk about babies' brains being a blank canvas when they're born, but actually that's not quite true, because development's beginning before that.
Yeah, in fact, development of the brain happens in the womb. There's loads of womb development that is dead fascinating. The fact that babies begin to do things like hear in the womb, but when they're beginning to hear, it's not necessarily through using the bones in their ears the way that we do, but it's through bone conduction, so that babies can hear via vibration through their the mother's bones when they're actually in the womb, but also when they begin in the end of the third trimester to develop the ability to hear in the way that we hear. Then they begin to recognise things like the theme tunes of things that you watch on the television or music that you play regularly. But babies' brains start developing, unsurprisingly, when they are in the womb, and they develop from the bottom up. So the first thing that babies develop is those basic things that keep you alive. So like we breathe when we're asleep, and it's a kind of involuntary action that we have. So the brain works around things like breath and how your heart beats and how your body works. Then the brain develops around movement, because obviously as a mammal, you might well want to have to escape or fight or whatever it may be. So the brain works on that ability to get you up and moving. And then the third thing, or the thing that comes most last, that makes sense, is that executive function, so the ability to think creatively, to manage your emotions, and that comes much later on, which is why often around 2 years of age you will get children who are quite physically developed and also can have some really good language development, but are not very well developed around their kind of executive function and emotion. So things like empathy, my ability to understand why you're upset and care, often doesn't come till fairly later on. And often as adults what we can do is try and get children to empathise with a situation that they've created, often through play, especially with siblings. And actually children haven't yet developed the ability to have that empathy, and therefore they can't do what it is that we're asking them to do.
Quick question just popped in, and I think it's worth also describing a little bit what the question means as well, because not everybody will know. But is this research from neuroscience? So first of all, what's neuroscience? And then back to answering the question.
So the neuroscience is the science around the brain, neurology. And so if you ever have any brain issues, you would go and see a neurologist. So neuroscience talks about how brain develops. And so what we know now in terms of early years education is, like, if I think back to 30 years ago when I started in early years education, then there was very little known or shared around neuroscience and brain development. But now we are much, much better at sharing the information, but also we know way more about how children's brains develop. So All the things we talk about today are based on neuroscience. We've also, as always, got a free guide that you can download, and the information for that is in our bio. And the free guide also goes into a lot more depth around brain development, but also links to the science that we've used in terms of creating that guide.
We think that's really important at My First 5 Years, that everything we say can be linked back to research and science. So when you use the app, for example, you can read further into everything we're saying, and when you do that further reading, it literally links you to the papers that you can then, if you really want to and you've got time, which most parents won't, but you can link all the way through to the research and where that's coming from. We always try to at least dual reference everything, so there's really credible information that we're sharing with you, which we just think is so important. Back to some of the questions. So, things that we can do to help a baby's brain develop. What are the key things that we should be thinking about?
I think when you're talking about brain development, it's about trying to get the brain to be as active as possible. So you've got different parts of your brain that actually, in early development, develop at different stages. And again, as I said, starts from the bottom and works up, so almost like the back to the front. And so the more interaction and experience that a child can have from being a tiny baby, then the more experiences they have, the more they have to use their brain to kind of evaluate those experiences, and therefore the more of those connections they are making in their brain. And that can be really simple stuff to start off with. So it's even just things like adult and child interactions, how you use your voice, environmental sounds, the feeling of being warm, the feeling of being cold, the ability to move about in the space that you are, being opened up to lots of different sorts of experience like that, even things down to like having some free time without a nappy on so that you can do a lot of kicking around and movement, gross motor stuff, small motor stuff. All of those things are beginning to build pathways within the brain, make those connections.
And what about the balance between sort of repetition and routine, but also novelty and doing things for the first time? I know that was something that we'd often repeat a lot of things when we were in the context of a nursery with young babies, to give them opportunities they could repeat and repeat, but then we'd also want to introduce new. So is there a balance to be had?
Absolutely. So you've got this idea that the new experience helps to build pathways within the brain because it's something new, and children's brains are going to have to work to process that newness. But also, if you're going for a walk in the countryside and somebody's following you and you walk down a path that's never been walked before, the person following you is going to struggle to find that path. If you walk down a path that's been well trodden, it's a really clear path. And the brain works a bit like that, in that the more we do things, the more well trodden the path becomes. So therefore, the more embedded and more secure that knowledge becomes. So children need lots of opportunities to try new things to get their brains stimulated, but they also need lots of routine and repetition, because A, you find security in that because you can predict what's coming next, and that's also linked to your brain, but also for tasks that you need to do. And if you think about everyday tasks that we do, like picking up a knife and fork or holding a pen, all the things that we do as adults, we learned them at one point, and we did them at one point for the very first time. And how we got it to be second nature is that idea that we did it again and again. I'm at the moment beginning driving lessons with my youngest son, and we're at that very beginning stage of which you forget when you're getting into the car and doing all the the mirror, clutch, blah blah blah, and how sometimes, like when you get to be an accomplished driver, you don't even think about what you're doing. And if you think about driving, it's a really complex thing that you're doing. You're doing lots of different things at once, but it becomes second nature. So for children, the more that we can repeat things that we do with them in a variety of different ways, the more they become second nature.
I think we say that slow, deep learning is so important for young children, and it's not about a race, it's not about trying to get them to the next thing as quickly as possible, because if we don't get those foundations really solid, we can sort of be growing on shaky ground, can't we?
So if you've got the app, you'll know that every day we present you with a range of activities. We've got well over 2,000 activities in the app now, and you can have a mix of 6 every day, which is the 6 streams of learning with an activity for your child. But also what we are doing, which you'll see in the app, is it says other ways that you can use this activity. So rather than saying just do this once in this way, we're presenting you with other options for how you can do the activity, again in a slightly different way. And partly that is for exactly what we're talking about. Partly it's for the repetition of the skill, but also to introduce it in a slightly different way that causes the brain to work really well.
And although we call them activities, they're quite often simple interactions, aren't they? It's not that sort of Instagram set it up for 2 hours to look pretty and take a picture. It's just really practical things that you can do with things from your kitchen cupboard or things outside the door. We're just trying to get parents really tuned into the value of play and what that's likely to be helping your child to learn.
And if you're talking about building it like a baby's brain, then obviously they're not going to be able to sit at a table and paint a paper plate to look like a penguin or whatever.
Not so those sort of activities.
But what this is about is those interactions that you can do with babies during things like tummy time. So if you want to build your baby's physical development, as well as you can give them some interaction to do during tummy time. Also, we know that not all babies love a bit of tummy time. So there are ideas in the app for if you've got a baby that doesn't like tummy time, and there are plenty that don't, what can you do? But even just during nappy changes, what you can do in terms of language exchanges. We talk a lot in my first 5 years about that familiar term to some of you, which is serve and return, which is how human beings learn. It's not always language serve and return. It just means that one person does something and another one responds. So it can be non-linguistic, but also you can have conversations with babies that are non-verbal, because they will be able to give you utterances, they'll watch very carefully what you're doing, and also they'll mimic things that you do, like the infamous one where I think all parents try it, where you stick out your tongue and your baby sticks out its tongue back. So those ideas of those interactions are really positive in terms of building brain.
We've had a question come here on the chat which says, my child is really chilled out in social occasions, to the point where another child could come and take his toy away and he just wouldn't mind at all. Is this normal brain development?
Well, that's way too complex a question to answer, because you've got brain development, but you've also got character, and then we're looking at things like nature versus nurture. So how much of this is about how your child's brain works and how much is it about their personality, and why, if they're just letting other children take their things and take everything and not having any issue with that, or then that might be worth a discussion around why your child is happy to do that. But actually a really chilled child that's just happy to share because they don't have that kind of possessiveness around their resources is not necessarily a bad thing. So it needs a bit more context, but also take into account your child's experience. If they've been in a COVID experience for the previous 2 years and not had a huge amount of interaction, that will affect how they're interacting with people who come and take their resources. It may not even occur to them that there's anything wrong with that. So there's probably a lot more context to this, but it doesn't sound like anything to particularly worry about.
Sounds gorgeous, to be fair.
Yeah, really chilled, really
really
kind.
chilled. A lot easier than the child that's going to be really, really unhappy when that happens and having to deal with that at playgroup, which are both perfectly normal developmentally.
Yeah.
Another question here. What about sensory play? Is that beneficial to building a baby's brain as well?
Absolutely. So if you think how your brain gets messages, it tends to get them through your senses. And so anything that stimulates your senses in terms of looking, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, all of those things are going to impact on your brain. And the more of those you can do at the same time, although don't put your child through like your trial, like how many, like a bush how many things can we, how many senses can we get going at once? So all of those things, the more you can do together. Now I'm going to say something else in a minute, but the more of those things you can do, then the more stimulating it is for the brain. But then there is always the high chance that you can overstimulate a child if you try too hard. So there is sensory overload, and there is such a thing as overstimulation. So if you've got even quite a young child, but anything that's noisy, busy, bright, all going on, what will happen is their brain, at the stage of development it's at, will just say, right, I can't cope with all of this at the same time, something's going to have to go. You know, like when you're in the car and you're lost, if you're anything like me, and my sense of direction is appalling, as Jenny will tell you. But if I've got the radio on and I'm lost, I have to turn the radio down to look at the map.
I have to turn it off, literally, because
Right, so,
it's like there's too much going on.
yeah,
I've never thought about that before.
That is basically sensory overload. That's your brain saying, I can't cope with thinking, looking, listening. So you as an adult will turn off the easiest thing to turn off to let your brain focus on the things you need to focus on. Children, especially babies, don't tend to have the ability to do that. So what they will do is cry or turn their way or often shut their eyes. But little children will show you if they're having sensory overload because they will withdraw. So part of building a really good brain is having spaces for that brain to breathe. And I don't mean breathe as in taking oxygen, which is obviously important for your brain, but breathe as in pause, quiet spaces, quiet moments, moments of contemplation, which just allow your brain to rest. So yes, stimulation is brilliant for building synapses that really help to develop a brain, but not when you are just literally stimulating your children 24/7, because that can have a negative effect on brain development.
I love it when you have a penny drop moment, and I've literally just had another one then where you shared the driving analogy, because honestly, when I'm lost, first thing that I do is turn the radio off, and I've never thought about that, but it's just so obvious, isn't it? You're overstimulated, you need to concentrate, turn something off. And then when you have that penny drop moment and you link it back to your child or your baby and child development, that's what I love about this journey with my first 5 years. You came and saw me about 15 years ago to talk about all this, and a lot of it is just common sense, and it just makes sense.
It literally is.
And when you ground it in your own experiences, it makes even more sense then, and you remember it. So radio off.
Yeah, or when you're talking on the phone, so this happens to me a lot. So I'm talking on the phone, and obviously my wife will have something to say about what I'm saying on the phone. So she'll be talking to me while I'm trying to listen on the phone. And I'm like, shh, I can't listen and talk at the same time. Of course I can listen and talk at the same time, but it is that very much, if I need to focus, then you need to kind of shut out anything else that's going to distract.
That question about whether you can overstimulate a brain actually came in as one of the questions beforehand, so you've answered that without me even asking.
Yeah, well, great, I'm good at that. So yeah, you need a good balance, and your gut will tell you what a good balance is, and you'll know what overstimulation feels like. But for little brains, overstimulation can happen fairly quickly because of the ability of the brain to process. For more sophisticated brains, the overstimulation, they can take a lot more stimulation before it becomes too much. So it's just about trial and error and giving your child plenty of opportunity just to experience new things, as well as we've talked about, that repetition.
It must also depend on environment. If I think about our house, I've got 3 children, and we've always lived in a really noisy house. There'll be telly on and music on and chatter going on, and I've had people visit our home and within a few minutes as an adult go, my God, this is a really noisy house. And when a baby's born into a house like that, that must become their background level of normal.
Yeah, I think so. And it's about, it's whether that's happening around them, and whether it's very much auditory stimulation, which they become very used to, or whether it's things like I'm stimulating you physically through touch, and I'm showing you things that are stimulating you visually, and I'm stimulating you auditorily. But yeah, I think you do build up a tolerance. I know that, for me, having worked in early years for 30 years and been in lots of environments with lots of children who are all making really good play-based active noise, I have a way higher tolerance for noise than other adults do. Yeah. And I think you just get used to that as being your norm.
A question coming in here about feeding. Any tips on how to show or teach self-feeding with a spoon? And is there any ideal age to start this?
So there is lots of information out there about that idea of weaning and when to introduce solid food, but also when to introduce the use of a spoon. So children can begin using a spoon from very, very early on because they have a palmar supinate grasp and they're able to grasp the handle of the spoon. Whether they actually get the spoon into their mouth is a completely different thing. So the novelty of the spoon will usually, unless they're very hungry, overtake the necessity to feed. So always expect that when you first introduce any kind of cutlery to children, always make sure it's the appropriate cutlery, and there's some really lovely stuff out there now that's been ergonomically created to fit into the hands of babies. But also the fact that they're likely to use it as an experiential / play tool to start off with until the novelty of the spoon wears off. So don't expect them to start spooning yogurt into their mouth, because it's not going to happen. They've obviously watched you do it, here's the aeroplane, blah, blah, blah. But once you give it to them, they have a huge sense of power, and also like it feels different in their hand. They've got to coordinate between getting their hand into their mouth, which they can't see. It's that ability to kind of aim for the hole and hope that you're going to get it there. So whenever a child shows interest, and from very early on, you can introduce the spoon, but expect them to have a period of time when it's more of a experiential, almost like a play resource, as opposed to be something they're going to use as a tool to feed themselves with.
So again, it's just those realistic expectations of child development, isn't it? And that it's going to take quite a long period of time of that practice and repetition thing before it becomes second nature. But we'd also kind of recommend that you roll with a mess, and you know, that some of these bibs that you can buy now that cover them from here and cover them to the end and you know, mean that the mess can't go anywhere. It also restricts their sensory involvement with that opportunity, doesn't it?
It really does, and it's a really hard one. And again, we probably could do a live on this, but the ideal of keeping your child clean, I get that, because obviously if you change a nullifier, for instance, it is when they're babies, and also having to clean up the mess. But actually the dropping of food down yourself, the mess that's on your high chair, the fact that food will actually drop onto the floor and not be caught, means all of those things are building children's brain connections and are important for their learning. So even the fact that they drop food and create mess when they're eating, all of those cause and effect. I do this, then this happens, or I didn't do this and then that happened. That's all brain building stuff. And a tip really, if you want to introduce things like utensils, is to get a bit of feeding out the way first and then introduce the spoon and let the child have it. If you give the spoon straight away, then you get a weird combination of I'm hungry, I can't feed myself, I'm frustrated, I've got this novelty thing stuck in my hand. Whereas if you get a few spoons down them and it fills them up a little bit, then you can know that anything that comes thereafter, if it doesn't all go in their mouth, that's okay, because they won't be hungry.
I'm reading this one literally as it's popped in, so bear with me because I've not got to the end of it. It says, what are your thoughts on the role of responsiveness and validation in those early years and brain building? Do you get the question?
Well,
and it's got a follow on, can you be too responsive?
Well, boredom is never a bad thing for lots of children, because boredom often spawns creativity. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I think what it is about is the idea of are you constantly responding to your baby, you're constantly stimulating your baby. And I think all of those things are positive to do, but also babies learn very quickly the level of expectation of interaction they're going to get. So at the very negative end of that, we know of children who don't expect to get a response from an adult and therefore don't ask for a response. And that is really heartbreaking. Yeah. And those children will often suffer lots of non-development of their brain in lots of different ways. So whereas you can have children who learn not to expect a response, you also have children, often your first child, who learns to expect a high level of response in adult interaction. So it is often first child syndrome, where everybody's so thrilled, you've managed to make this baby, and you literally, it's your life's mission to stimulate this baby on a momentary basis, and then everybody that visits your house stimulates the baby on a momentary basis. So that baby learns to have a very high expectation and tolerance of stimulation. So if you want some peace in your life, then it's good to have stimulation for your baby, but you don't need to be doing it all the time. And also, being a realistic parent will mean that there are days when you will be exhausted, or on days where you just haven't got anything left, and that's okay, because actually babies and children who are also given some periods of time for downtime, reflection, and as I said, a little bit of boredom, where they're not constantly being pushed with an activity or an idea, causes them to use their brains to generate, and that can be really creative and also really help with that brain development.
Yeah, there's a question come through here. What can damage building a healthy brain then? I kind of say that our children are born perfect and then we mess them up.
Yeah.
It's kind of...
That's a very polite way of putting it, yes.
How can we do the least damage possible? We all do our best, but, it is difficult.
So you can overstimulate and you can understimulate. And then, of course, children's brains aren't all neurotypical and don't all develop in the same way. So different children will have different tolerances for different things depending on their particular brain development. And again, when we talked about science at the very beginning, we are understanding so much more about neurodiversity and now neurodivergence, and how we're all really neurodiverse. None of our brains are exactly the same, but different adults and children have different levels of neurodivergence. So therefore, it's not the same for all children, and you will get that message very quickly from your child. So what you're trying to do, I think, as a realistic parent, is try to provide your child with lots of new experiences, and again, very much grounded in my first 5 years belief that they can be somewhere in your house or just outside your front or back door. They don't have to be things that you spend hundreds of pounds worth on buying in toys and tech. And again, in the very early stages of development, you get sold a lot to as a parent around baby tech and baby toys that light up and flash and make big noises. And those, can be interesting, but they're not necessary. You can do everything that they do just using what's in the world around you. So providing opportunities for your baby that link also with your routine. So when you are making the tea, you are giving them things to touch and hold and feel and taste that are appropriate, but that are different. You are going out for a walk. You are trying to get them front facing when you can, especially if you've got,
facing to you.
Yes, as in facing front. So lots of buggies and prams face out, which means that children get to have kind of outside view of the world, but don't get to face their adult. And we know that, ideally you'd have ones that would swivel a bit, but when you can face an adult, you can still see, and the adult can prompt and narrate and navigate and discuss, so you tend to get a lot better interaction. So trying to make the stimulation fit into your everyday. And when it snows, you'll take them out in the snow for a little while. When it's windy, taking them out into the wind. When it's rainy, allowing them to feel a little bit of rain, when it's appropriate, not soaking them at the beginning of a journey and having to soak child at the end. But I mean, I was looking at some photographs the other day as part of a piece of research that I was reading, which is about children in a playgroup that were all lined up in their buggies with the rain hoods on the top. And it had been raining. And it had stopped raining, and they were all lined up, and the parents were chatting. And what the paper was about was the view of the baby through the hood. So the sound, the visual, the fact that everything was distorted by the rain. And as an adult, how would we have felt if we'd been left in that situation? So giving your baby lots of opportunities to experience the world they live in, which doesn't need a lot of extra tech, but not feeling that you have to literally be providing activities and events for your baby to take part in on an hourly basis to build their brain.
Yeah, I mean, yourself, like we have a really busy work diary the next 2 days, and it's constant and there's no downtime. And we hate it when we have days like that because it is just overstimulating. And it's the same for, I think sometimes if you try and put yourself in their shoes a little bit and think, actually, we all enjoy a bit of downtime, a bit of, just thinking time, a bit of going for a walk, getting for some fresh air. So it's those sort of same ideas.
And
common
again,
sense.
What's interesting in terms of parenting is that sometimes you can think that the more you give your child, the better outcomes they will get. So sometimes they'll have a full day at nursery or a full day at school, and then they'll go on to do an after-school club, and then they'll go on to do a maths session, or they'll go on to do sport, and all of those things individually might be really productive, but often we think if we give them lots and lots and lots of opportunities to do extracurricular stuff and the work they're doing at school, that will be better for making their brains better and giving them better chances. But actually sometimes that can just overstimulate and exhaust them, and actually what they need is some downtime, whatever that downtime is. Because for the brain that's equally as important. Time to consolidate and rehearse what you know. But also that's why sleep is so important, because your brain processes loads of what you do during the day while you are asleep. And especially if you're a growing brain and a growing body, that's why babies sleep so much. So really good opportunities for children to have that downtime can be more impactful than having lots and lots of activities that fill their day.
Cool. I think we're getting close to the end of our half hour, so maybe just a bit of a killer end question, which is just if you had just a couple of takeaways about things that we could do as parents with our babies to just really help this concept of brain development, what would be your top tip or two?
I think when you are thinking about doing the best that you can for developing your baby's brain, one is to listen and watch your child, because they will give you clear interactions of when they want to engage and when they don't want to engage because they've had enough. Build brain building into your everyday. Don't see it as something you need to do with somebody else necessarily or with a special event or an activity. Try and make it about your everyday routines. Give your children plenty of things that they've never done before so they can experience something new, but also invest in those routines like a bedtime routine, a bath time routine, a nappy time routine, because that security also helps to build their brain. And the other thing that I wish we had more time to talk about is that as your child's brain is developing, when they begin to develop that higher order thinking where emotion sits, and they begin to try and work out the complex world of feelings, often their physical body can develop faster than their emotional brain. And what children really need through that period of time is lots of understanding and support. And sometimes that feels counterintuitive to parents. So when your child is literally having a meltdown in Tesco's, what you want to do is just scoop them up and move them out of the situation, probably down to your embarrassment, which we've all experienced. But actually, when we look at really good brain development and we look at strategies for what children need in those moments of high anxiety or when they're processing emotion, it's rarely your gut response. So for us as parents, it's about knowing better what the recommended response is and treating those moments ideally as stages of development rather than just like, oh my goodness, embarrassing moments, bad behaviour. It's to try and reframe that and think, okay, this is making me feel uncomfortable, but this is actually a perfectly normal and natural stage of development. What my child doesn't need is me kind of butting up against them. What they do need is me kind of calming it down and then revisiting later on. And again, in the app, there are loads of strategies for how to do that. And also on our website, we've got, and they're referenced in the free guide, we've got various blogs and articles that would support you in that.
Cool. So yeah, free downloadable guide about building baby's brain in the bio. And also 2 weeks from now, we'll be doing our next live, which is going to be just concentrating on actually some practical activity ideas that you can do in the home and out and about in the environment that can help build your baby's brain. I'm struggling with baby's brain today. I think my brain is
you need
just...
a bit of boredom.
Yeah, I need a bit of boredom. So thanks for joining us. The app is still free right now. It's not going to be free for much longer, but if you're using the app and you love it, please give us a review on the App Store. We'd love that, wouldn't we?
Yeah, we would.
We were App of the Day last week, which we were incredibly excited about. So yeah, share it with your friends and download it and give it a go. And somebody's just said, do you save your lives?
Yes, you can access the lives on YouTube and also you can access them on our Instagram account. So yes, the lives are all up there for you to revisit and share if you want to.
I'm so glad you understood that question because
Yes,
I was
my
reading it
brain
live.
is working.
Your brain is working a lot better than my brain today. I clearly need more sleep. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks'
See you next time.
Bye.